Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Sangmani Labut. I am the executive director of the Eastside Freedom Library. And so, for access purposes, I am a brown skinned man with dark hair wearing black frame glasses and a white shirt. Thanks for being here this evening with us to help the Eastside Freedom Library kick off our 10th anniversary series, Love and Solidarity. We are thrilled to be partnering with the Institute for Advanced Study at the University of Minnesota as part of their IS Thursdays Injustice series. I also would like to thank our co-sponsors, the University of Minnesota Hubbard School of Journalism and the Department of Sociology for this. Again, thanks for joining us this evening for Beyond Banned Books, Rising Against Fascism. If this is your first time here at the Eastside Freedom Library, welcome. The Eastside Freedom Library is an independent nonprofit organization. Our work is around the intersection of African American history, immigration history, labor history, and social movements. We have in our collection over 35,000 books and materials which really inform our work and what we do in our community. Our mission is to inspire solidarity, advocate for justice, and work towards equity for all. And so to fulfill our mission, we do do many programs such as the one that we are having today. And so as the Eastside Freedom Library is celebrating our 10th anniversary, we are proud to really present the Love and Solidarity series. The series is really a testament of our core value of justice, of equity, and of solidarity. So since 2013, our work is really centered on this concept of love and solidarity, drawing from the inspiration of historical moments that really embody these values. We are very committed to grounding our work as an organization to practice of the love and solidarity, and to strive to really help bring a more just and equitable society. So to mark this occasion, there will be a series of a year-long program. This one is a kickoff to that program. And so we are very committed in ensuring that stories of our community are heard and uplifted. The commitment has become all more important in the past couple of years, as we have seen an alarming increase of concerted efforts to silence the words and stories and truths of so many communities. And so at Eastside Freedom Library, we know just how powerful the community can be. And so I'm so glad that you are here with us today. And so in the spirit of our work, we also invite you all to join us to celebrate and uplift the values of love and solidarity, really against those attempts to dismiss and diminish our collective stories. And so as a way for us to push back, we're doing another event called Read to the Max. And so please talk to our staff about it. We invite you to read a 15-minute excerpt from your favorite Challenger banned books. We'll record them and we'll share them on November 16th as part of our Read to the Max event. And so program like this, the one we're having tonight, is made possible by our supporters, collaborators, and partners. And we know that creating lasting change requires help from everyone, from our supporters. And your support through your donation, time, and commitment to the Eastside Freedom Library will really help us fulfill our mission towards an additional 10 years and more than that. And so we value your energy and your presence here today. And if you feel so inclined to donate, there's white envelopes in your chairs. For folks online, we can put some donation link online as well. So again, thank you for joining us this evening. I will now pass it along to our partner for this event, Bianette Castellanos, Director of the Institute for Advanced Study at the University of Minnesota. Take it away, Bianette.
Thank you so much, Sang. My name is Bianca Castellanos. I am the director of the Institute for Advanced Study at the University of Minnesota, and I'm really delighted to be here with all of you today. And I'm also delighted to be here with the East Side Freedom Library. For access purposes, I am a brown-skinned woman with dark hair, wearing glasses, and with black frames and a black blouse. We are so thankful to be here in partnership with the East Side Freedom Library tonight to help celebrate their 10th anniversary. It's no coincidence that their series, Love and Solidarity, comes at the same time that the IAS has launched our own series, Injustice, which brings together scholars, artists, and community leaders to offer different lenses to approach today's pressing problems and explore their own visions of what justice might look like. Together, we hope to gain a deeper understanding of how to build a better future and a more just world. Over the course of the next 2 years, we will be spending time discussing themes like abolition, indigenous data sovereignty, trans rights, ableism, the Mexico-US border, religion, incarceration, policing, the climate crisis, and much more. Tonight's conversation on book banning in America is just the beginning. We're thrilled to be here tonight with our colleagues and all of you, and I'm excited to see what this conversation will bring. But before we get started, I'd like to remind you of a few technical issues. Online attendees have access to both professional captioning and ASL interpretation. Later in the program, we will use an app called Slido to facilitate our Q&A. So due to the size of our audience today, in-person attendees are also encouraged to use this method. But if you prefer, you can still raise your hand, and someone will bring a microphone to you. To use Slido, we will display a QR code on the screen, or you can use your smartphone or browser to go on to www.slido.com. and enter the code #bannedbooks. Questions can be submitted anonymously, and we encourage you to upvote submitted questions to help ensure we address those questions in the queue based on audience interest priority. And please note that in order to respond to as many questions as possible, we may occasionally combine related questions. And now, without further delay, it is my pleasure to formally introduce today's guests. Robin D.G. Kelly is Distinguished Professor and Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair in U.S. History at UCLA. His research has explored the history of social movements in the United States, the African diaspora in Africa, Black intellectuals, music and visual culture, surrealism, Marxism, and more. A prolific essayist, Kelly is widely published and serves as a contributing editor of the Boston Review. His current book projects include Black Bodies Swinging, an American Postmortem on the Political Economy of Premature Death and the Struggle to Preserve Black Life, as well as a general survey of African American history written with Professor Tara Hunter. Roderick Ferguson is a William Robertson Co-Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and American Studies at Yale University, and one of my former colleagues here at the university. He is the author of the books One Dimensional Queer, We Demand, the University and Student Protests, The Reorder of Things, the University and its Pedagogies of Minority Difference, and Aberrations in Black, Toward a Queer of Color Critique. He is a co-editor with Grace Hong of the anthology Strange Affinities, The Gender and Sexual Politics of Comparative Racialization. He is also co-editor with Erica Edwards and Jeffrey Ogbar of Keywords of African American Studies. And he is a 2020 recipient of the Kessler Award from the Center for LGBTQ Studies. Kristen Reynolds is a doctoral candidate in the Department of American Studies at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. She studies the role that Black speculative art plays in decentering the human in dominant technologies. She's especially invested in considering the ways that Afro-pessimist and Black feminist theories of the human and Afrofuturist interrogation of being shift our understanding of dominant digital technologies and who those technologies are built to serve. Her work currently explores datification, cryptocurrency, blockchain, and surveillance. She's published in the FIA Literary Magazine and continues to explore opportunities to place her creative and academic work in conversation. Finally, our moderator for today is Clarence White. Clarence is the Associate Director of the East Side Freedom Library and an instructor at Minneapolis College. He is a writer, typewriter, poet, curator, and ice skating instructor. He is a past retreat fellow with the Givens Foundation of African American Literature and Loft Literary Center Mentor Program. His work is found in the St. Paul Almanac, Suisun Valley Review, the Cortland Review, Poetry in the Windows on Lake Street, Minneapolis, Barstow and Grand, and Public Art Review. His essay, Smart Enough for Ford, appears in the anthology Blues Vision, African American Writing for Minnesota. And he lives in St. Paul. So please join me in giving them a very warm welcome. And I now invite Clarence to get us started.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming here to the Eastside Freedom Library. I guess for accessibility, I am a medium brown-skinned male with thinning hair, wearing a dark green sweater and a light shirt, and dark glasses, dark frame glasses. I again want to welcome you into the space, as my colleague Sangmani did. I also want to mention to the folks here in the room, there is a sign-in sheet. We would love to remain in touch with you at the front desk. My other colleague Bailey is holding it up for you to see. Lovely little form there that is easy to read. Thank you, Minna. And we have a lot of things going on, even in addition to the banned book series. So I don't want to spend too much time before we get to our esteemed guests' conversation. One of the things that wasn't mentioned, I'm a former bookseller at the Hungry Mind bookstore from way back when. And we always had on our shelf a copy of Mein Kampf. And you may ask why. The owner of the store was a Jewish man whose family had a long history that brought them here to the United States. And why would he insist on that book being in the store? And you could explain it in a lot of ways. I would explain it differently than he would. But the access to that information is crucial to all of us to know what is being thought. And just the idea that someone would take that away is the threat of us being more ignorant and making the threat of those things even greater. So with that in mind, I want to hand the conversation over to you folks. I know you want to have a very free-flowing conversation, but hopefully, we'll get to some really key points about like the history of book banning, how what's going on now is very similar to the history that we've seen here and other places. Maybe some things that some institutions can think about in response to that, and maybe what we as individuals can do, but to place it in a clearer context for a conversation that's going to move our thinking forward. So I don't know who wants to start off. I'm looking at the middle.
That's why I didn't want to sit in there.
Exactly.
I was saying
You
that.
go first, Robert.
Okay. Well, I jotted down some notes because I was told to talk for about 5 minutes or so at the beginning. But before I do that, for access purposes, I'm black male. Some would say light skin. I do not say high yellow. I have a blue shirt. Really nice glasses, and I'm kind of slight, short, and very happy to be here. So before I say anything, I see my friend Peter Ratcliffe, who is the brainchild behind all this. Peter and Beth, and Peter, we go back more than 30 years. More than 30 years. And so this is an honor to be in this space, both in terms of what it represents, all of you being here, what it means in terms of where it is in the community. So all that's very important. And in fact, let's remember that, if you read the book that I did with Kianga Yamada Taylor and Colin Kaepernick, Rod Ferguson has a wonderful essay on the Midnight School. And of course, he mentions the East Side Freedom Library as one of the examples. Yeah, I read it. Read it. Okay, so let me, and then also everyone who organized this, thank you so much also to be here with the great Kristen Reynolds. So it's important to be here. And let me say a few things about book bans and the political work they do. Because, it's not an accident that book bans come from the right. I'm not saying that there are not people on the left who are like trying to move things away or ignore things. That's true, but in terms of organized book bans, they come from the right. And they're tied to fascism. And I have to say that when I first learned that Ron DeSantis and the Florida Department of Education wanted to remove all these texts from the AP African American Studies curriculum, my first response was like, all that stuff's online. Why is that an issue? Of course, for the College Board, it's an issue because they license the stuff and they make money, but that's a different story. But then, when you think about it, the same holds true for all book bans. I mean, all the stuff that they're banning, you can get access to. Because it's not about access. It's because the point is to not necessarily stop people from reading what they're going to read. It's about generating fear. That's the whole point. You think about the way that just the mention of book bans are used to mobilize the right politically, in legislative assemblies, on the streets, in schools, to attack liberal arts education, to incite violence against queer, trans, non-binary people, against Black, brown, Asian, indigenous people, to incite violence, right? That's different. I mean, they don't really care if you got the book, but the idea that the book should be banned is generating a discourse among people who wouldn't read that book in the first place, who should. By extension, it is to promote a war of extermination, targeting trans people and more broadly the LGBTQIA communities, but persuading large swaths of the population to back what's the next stage: anti-trans laws, denying gender-affirming care, anti-drag laws, and the like. And these acts of elimination begin with what appears to be a discursive erasure, but it's not a discursive erasure. It is a spotlight. It's a target. The idea is like, you're walking down the streets when the cops shine that floodlight on you. It's not to erase, it's to bring attention to make you a target of the kind of all forms of violence, the more discursive violence and physical violence. So last thing I want to say is that, two things, is that when Moms for Liberty, go out, with all the money they get from the right, going out with signs and making a spectacle does more work than the actual removal of the physical book, And finally, all these attacks, what they do, and I'm glad you started out with Mein Kampf, because those books are not being banned. There's a whole litany of racist books. You could start with Thomas Jefferson's Notes on Virginia. No one's trying to get that off the bookshelves, and I'm not trying to get it off either. But the one thing is, what these bans do is they turn anti-racists into the enemy or the perpetrator, and the people identified as white as the victim. Meanwhile, marginalized white people who really are victims of stagnant wages, privatized healthcare, big pharma, tax policies that redistribute wealth upwards, they're taught that they live in what was once, long time ago, the perfect country until woke showed up and gave all their hard-earned income to Negroes and immigrants who are trying to take their guns. So in this anti-woke world of extreme right, white nationalist vigilantes, they're the heroes. Anti-racist organizers trying to save the planet are the villains. democracy is the enemy of liberty. There are only two genders, right? One civilization, one master race, and women and Black people have to know their place. That is what this is all about. That's why I always say it's a political struggle, you know? And anyone who says, if only Ron DeSantis read my book, you need to go back and reread your own book if you think that. So that's what I want to say, just as an opening.
That's great.
You can clap. Go ahead. You know, for the people back home online, just like, you know, you can stand up if you want to.
Who would like to go next?
Okay, well, I'll go next. You know, see, for access purposes, I am also wearing all blue, blue pants, a blue shirt with little, I think these are izods. Is that what they're called?
Yeah,
izods. White izods. You know, I am a Black man, I guess medium complected. And I have on blue glasses that I think are also really, really cool. Thank you. I have on cool socks. I love my socks. My socks are striped red and black with black Adidas's with blues and yellows and greens. Okay. It's a pleasure to be here. I have also known Peter since I started at the University of Minnesota, which is my first position in 2000. And it's wonderful to see, you know, this wonderful space that he and Beth have built. It's also really good to be back and to see longtime friends and to meet other folks. You know, in terms of the subject of book bans, it's interesting. I always go to the larger context of like the sort of attack on literacy, you know, and the, you know, Robin touched on this, the way in which the book bans, the attacks on literacy are also about banning people, you know? But they're also about, you know, controlling the kinds of people who are already here, but also the kinds of people that could be in the world. The piece that I wrote for the book that Robin Kienga and Colin Kaepernick did begins with the story of the Midnight Schools. You know, the Midnight School was started by an enslaved Black woman in Mississippi, Mrs. Granderson. And the story goes is that she started this school in secret around midnight, because if you're an enslaved person, that's the only time that you have, you know, that's yours, right? And the archive says that she took 12, which it calls an apostolic number, 12 at a time. She would teach them to read. And over several years, hundreds of people were taught to read and write by Mrs. Granderson. And it says that many of them wrote their own passes and stole away to Canada, okay? And that's significant for me because I think everything that we need to know is in that story, right? Because you have a story of, you know, the prohibition of literacy, you know, for a minoritized population, which is also part of the oppression of that population, the bodily oppression, the political oppression, the intellectual oppression, right? So those things always go hand in hand. You know, if we're talking about the banning of queer literatures, the banning of feminist literatures, the banning of Black literatures and anti-racist literatures, these are also about the banning of people, you know, who are already here, the banning of indigenous literatures. Also about the regulation of Native populations and communities, all right? And for me, it was also a kind of clarifying moment when the DeSantis stuff started to happen, because, you know, especially that line in the anti-woke legislation in Florida, where it's the repetition of protecting white children, right? And then I thought, oh, right, this is also what they're afraid of.
Right.
They're afraid that the white kids will actually be transformed, you know, that they will learn. And of course, what did people see, you know, on the television during the 2020 protests? Of course, during the Black Lives Matter protests, you saw black people protesting, but you also saw white people participating in the protests. So there are those fantastic images of the dads in Portland with their leaf blowers, you know, blowing away the tear gas, right? Well, if you're a racist, that would terrify you. Why? Because the people that you thought were in your pocket, you know, may all of a sudden not be, and may not be because of their encounter with anti-racist protests and also anti-racist literatures. And so at that moment, you know, as a teacher, the stakes became really clear to me. It's sort of like, okay, these are intellectual stakes, these are political stakes, but they're also spiritual stakes, right? You know, in a sense of, we will not let you have access to your birthright of self-transformation, right? We will not let you have access to the knowledge that says that you are a historical being and agent and you may be able to change the world around you. You know, like what's that wonderful line from Baldwin where he says, the world is here before you and you do not have to accept it the way it was when you came in? That's what they don't want people to come into consciousness around, right? So for me, the book bannings, you know, there's a way in which we have to deliteralize them, right? They're about bigger existential questions. They're about, you know, whether or not people can have access to a sense of their own potentials and inner powers. You think of this wonderful speech that Ella Baker, you know, the great civil rights activist, gave in 1968. And she says, the point of any progressive movement is to get people to see the potential and the power that already resides within them. You know? And it seems to me that part of what the right wing aims to do is to alienate people from that part of themselves. Okay? So that's what, that'd be my opening remarks.
Thank you. So, Kristen.
Yeah, I should have gone first. For accessibility purposes, I'm a Black woman with a teeny weeny afro at the moment because it's just curlier today. I'm wearing pecan black glasses, also dope. So just make sure you get that in the captions. I'm wearing a black blazer and a black shirt from Uncle Bobby's bookstore in Philly that says read banned books, and it's got banned crossed out. And I'm wearing blue jeans and cool socks with mushrooms on them. The girlies are into shrooms these days. My poor husband has been listening to me like talk about banned books, like probably since they asked me to be on this panel, because I was like, I got to be ready. I'm going to be on stage with like Dr. Ferguson and Dr. Kelly. I have to be ready and not embarrass my advisors. And so I've been thinking a lot about my parents, actually, because the two of them really let me just live my full and best life in the library. I spent a lot of time in the library. I checked out The Little Mermaid, got, you know, the old like plastic book video case things that you used to have to open. I used to check that out all the time. I checked out books all the time from the library with my mom. Like that was the thing that we did together. And I remember when I was really young, my dad read Elin Harris. I don't know if y'all know who that is, but my dad like really loved Elin Harris's books. And because he was reading them, I read them. And I remember making a comment at my wedding luncheon the day before I got married that my parents never really censored what I read. They were always really fully present in what I read, and we had conversations about what we did, but they didn't censor what I read. And that's one thing that I always really value about our relationship, is that they're always really present with me as I explore the world through literature. And I think that for me is one of the key things that's missing from the conversation is what it looks like to to embrace your child's right to their inner world.
Yes, that's right.
And into privacy, right? And I understand that it's contentious, right? Because young people, we want them to be safe in the world. But what does it mean to allow them to explore the world on their own through books?
No, absolutely. You should say who Elin Harris.
So Elin,
was,
I can't remember the name of the book, but I think it was oh gosh. I can't remember the names of the books. I should have looked them up before I came in here. But Elin Harris had these really lovely books where just the books featured lots of queer folks. And some folks were kind of like navigating the difficulty of being in the closet and coming out of the closet. But I thought, God, I had to have been like maybe 10 or 12 when I was reading those books. But I encourage all of you to look Elin Harris up. He passed away a few years ago, I believe. But I would just remember really loving those stories. And having this sense of like, oh, this is how adults are living their lives. And being really eager to be an adult myself. But either way, so I was also spending some time, like, as I was thinking about what it meant to sort of be a young person sort of navigating book bans and what it means to like include them in the conversation. So I also really wanted to bring some numbers into the conversation, right? I think that information matters. What I was reading was that there's about a 38% increase in challenged books from like 2022 to 2023. And so far, just this year alone, you can look this up on the American Library Association's website. Just this year alone, there's been about 1,600 unique titles that have been challenged. And I think, Dr. Kelly, you said this about how things sort of get pulled out of rotation, right? Even just the challenge of the book is going to pull it out of circulation because folks still have to contend with that challenge. So the book doesn't have to actually be banned, right? And so I think about that a lot in relationship to my own work because I study technology. And I've been thinking about how technology has expanded people's ability to rapidly ban these books. And one of the things that I found was that there's one website that debuted in 2022. It's called Book Looks, I think, or Lookbooks, one or the other, .com. And they actually make it very easy for people to just go to their site, download a complaint, and then send it to the library. Folks don't even have to read it. They can just download it. And so when you think about how technology is being weaponized in these ways and how right-wing conservatives are organizing online in relatively low-tech ways, right? It's not an app. It's just a website. And it doesn't even look that good. But folks can just go to it. They can just download a whole bunch of books, and then that becomes the complaint. And so it's really, I think, played a significant role in how quickly and how rapidly folks have mobilized around getting books banned in their communities. And the other thing that I also want to point out, too, is that it's actually public libraries that are experiencing the largest percentage of book bans. And so we have a lot of conversations about schools and school librarians, but it's 48% of the book bans are being targeted towards public libraries. And I think that really matters because sometimes we take these infrastructures, these public infrastructures for granted, and we assume they're always going to be here and that we're always going to have access to them. So I think that it's really important for us to think about that in terms of how we organize against it as well. Right. And I'll stop there.
Lovely.
Can I just add one? Just I'm worried about the transcription on the Zoom thing. It's Lynn Harris because it could sound like Elin. I just want to make sure because we know that, but some people may not know that, and they're really beautiful books. That was a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, can we have a conversation? Can we start the conversation now?
Yes.
I love it that you began with that story about your father and your father reading Elin Harris. So this, Elin Harris was a Black gay author who produced, some of the most popular novels about Black gay male life, right? And my mother was that person in my life. She took me to get my first library card. And I grew up in rural Georgia, right? And the county regional library was, maybe this is even bigger, and on one side was the kids section. And I began reading, Greek mythology in that section because I loved Linda Carter and Wonder Woman. And I was trying to figure out where the Amazons came from. And on the other side was the adult section. And one day I decided, okay, everybody's talking about ninjas. So there's a book I see on the adult side, Eric von Lustbader's The Ninja. and it had a sword, a samurai sword or a ninja sword, and in the reflection, there was a naked white woman and a ninja behind her. And I remember going in like 5th grade to get the book and then taking it to the librarians, you know, and they looked at each other and they said, "We don't think this is appropriate for you." And then I said, "Okay." And then I told one of my teachers, and she wrote a letter to the librarians explaining that certain children, because of their reading capacity and their maturity, are ready for adult books. And then so I took the letter to the librarians, and the librarian said, "You can have the book, but you have to make sure that your mother's okay with it." So then I brought the book home, and I showed it to Mama, and I showed her the letter, and she looked and she said, "Boy, whatever, go ahead and read it." You know? And, you know, also an addendum to your, you know, so your factoids about the rise in banned books. Toni Morrison is the most banned author at this moment. It's significant because around that time, in the 1980s, that's when I kind of credit Black women writers with teaching me how to read. You know, it was Alice Walker's The Color Purple. It was Beloved. I wrote my senior thesis on Beloved. And I remember all of the controversy around The Color Purple because it dealt with patriarchy, it dealt with sexual violence, incest, lesbianism. And I remember thinking, okay, I have to find a way in rural Georgia to read these books with themes that are scary. You know? So, and I really think that Black women taught a whole nation how to do that, you know? How do you grapple with, you know, things that are uncomfortable, you know? You know, how do you spend time with histories of violence, right, in detail? And so, you know, that kind of stretching of the reader, you know, of the growth of the reader is exactly what is at stake, you know, at this moment.
That's right.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think, like, having worked as a student affairs professional in higher ed and worked in, like, you know, cultural centers and things like that, I think a lot about the students who got to have their first opportunities to be out and be called by the name that they chose and have their pronouns respected. Like, that happens for them a lot when they leave home and they go to college. And I think a lot of how they get to explore that aspect of their identity, especially in spaces where it's not safe for them to be out, is through books. And I had a student who was preparing to go home for spring break and had mentioned something about, you know, just preparing for that and having to go back to being called by a name that they no longer wanted to be called by, because they weren't out to their family and they were only out to their brother. And I think there's something real. We're doing significant harm, as I think a lot of you already know, when we tell young people and the people that care for them that they should not exist. And when you so actively work to erase the things that make them feel safe and vulnerable. And I think, to your point, being able to pick up a book and have those conversations or explore those ideas in a safe place is really important before you have to go out into the world and engage people on certain topics and certain ideas. I think for me personally, books gave me a lot of language to articulate things in my life that I wasn't able to articulate before. And we're also really taking that away from people too.
That's right. Yeah, I have my library stories, but I think I'm much older than everyone here. So I'm willing to share if you want to hear them.
Yes, we want to hear library stories.
Okay, see, so I grew up as a young kid in Harlem in the 60s. And at a time when, you know, our public libraries, with the exception of Schaumburg. Schaumburg was a very different thing, but it wasn't in my neighborhood. I was sort of west side, 157th. Our public libraries were not as good as our Black bookstores. So Liberation Books was one place where they were like libraries in the sense that, you can, my mother would take us there all the time, and you could sit there and read what's there if you don't want to buy the book. But that's where I discovered, as a very young person, people like William L. Patterson and Herbert Aptheker and people like that in the 60s. On the other hand, libraries, at least in my neighborhood, were safe spaces, because if you didn't want to, get into a fight, if you didn't want to deal with everything outside, you could sit there all day. And even if the pickings were kind of limited, it was a safe space, and it was in the library that the pickings for me, because all the black books were in the bookstores. And this is in Harlem. My PS-28, we didn't have a lot of that yet. But I read books about cars. That was it. I knew everything you want to know about, Le Mans, and so the amazing thing is that even things that are really, really limited, that would never be on the chopping block, it was there. And it wasn't, I can't make the argument that the library itself in my neighborhood was a place where I found identity. It was really almost like in my home library, like the books that my mother brought home and purchased for us. And for her, very much, in fact, like both of your parents, there were no limitations. In other words, we could read as advanced as we can go. And my older sister taught me how to read, and so she was always more advanced than me. So that, so in some ways, I'm nostalgic for that, because I have children now who, my youngest, has trouble just picking up a book for various reasons. And part of it is the distractions of the screen. And not to say that digital means are not great, because you have access to even more books than we've ever had. But it's the act, the process, the imagination that's required to sort of take yourself to a place with words on a page. That is a different kind of exercise. And I don't have an answer for that, but that's one thing I worry about.
I just want to remind folks, both here in the audience as well as our virtual audience, that using Slido, you can start thinking about your questions and pose them to help us advance this conversation. And I'm glad that this conversation has gone to libraries. I think we could really explain a lot of this just by observing libraries and what's happening with them. So I appreciate you sharing that story, and that we've gone in that direction. So I want to continue.
I think there's something that you actually mentioned that I also was reflecting on, where you said the library was like a safe space for you to go if you didn't want to get into a fight and things like that. And my favorite sociologist, Tracy McMillan Cottom, shout out, recently interviewed the current president of the ALA. I think her name is Emily Drabinsky, I think is her name. And speaking of digital things, I learned all this on a podcast, because I gotta get the information in while I'm cleaning my house, otherwise I'm studying. But one of the things that they talked about was the kind of social services that libraries provide. And when you have such a drastic increase in the numbers of books that are being challenged and banned, somebody has to take care of that work. Somebody has to pull those books off the shelf. Somebody has to evaluate those things. And one of the things that Emily pointed out was those folks get removed from being able to provide the services that libraries provide for communities. They have to, or librarians are also leaving their jobs. There is a librarian in Louisiana who was getting death threats, and she decided to leave. She decided to move, right? So there's this very real physical violence that's associated with these things that are taking place online. And they're impacting communities in really significant ways. Like libraries are, curtailing hours because they don't have the staff to support, staying open later, which impacts us even more in this time where people go to the library to cool off in the summer or to stay warm in the winter. That really matters in a place like Minnesota. So I think in the conversation of like placing these things in their larger context, we also have to think about the social service that libraries provide. One of the things that there's this library in Iowa or Idaho that people can sign up for carpet cleaners, because carpet cleaners, I don't know how many of you clean carpets. There's a lot of hardwood floors here in the Twin Cities. But carpet cleaners are expensive, and they have this rotation of carpet cleaning where people can just check it out and clean their homes and bring it back. And that might seem really small, but that matters to folks who want to have a nice, clean, presentable house and otherwise could not afford that thing. Maybe I shouldn't say this on Zoom, but I have 3 library cards. I still have my library cards from California. They haven't kicked me out yet. But one of the things that I really loved about the libraries in California is you can sign up for like public park passes, so you don't have to pay for that out of pocket.
Right.
There's so many different services the libraries provide that include books, but also extend beyond that, and it's not lost on me that in this moment where more librarians and more libraries are leaning into that role of like providing these kinds of social services, the right-wing conservatives are doing what they're doing to get at those services, because they want us all to they want us to suffer. That's really what it is.
Right.
I remember, and probably other people do too, when librarians were criminalized after 9/11.
Yeah.
You know, the ways in which the librarian became a suspect figure, you know, in terms of, are they supporting terrorism? You know, I remember, because I think it was, what was it, my first and second year at the U, all of us got this email from the administration asking us to report, you know, suspicious people, whether they be colleagues or, you know, strangers on the campus. And I remember that moment being one in which, at least to my knowledge, I saw a kind of concerted surveillance of librarians. Which also reminds me, Robin, you talk in the piece that you wrote, you know, in the anthology, about the Cold War, you know, as one of those sites in which there was a crackdown, you know, on literacy and also on people.
Right.
Do you want to say?
Yeah. No, in fact, this ties to something else I was thinking about in terms of libraries. So, you know, when you think about the ebb and flow of book bans, it's amazing how they peg to sort of moments of prosperity in some ways. The Cold War is interesting because of the extreme anti-communism. Everything was under suspicion. And especially, you know, because of course, whenever there's a kind of Red Scare, they always go after anything having to do with race first, you know. In fact, if you read J. Edgar Hoover's own writing, I think it's like Know Your Enemy or whatever, he has this line, if it's not that book, some other book, where if you see Negroes walking out of a house in a white neighborhood, you know they're communists, you know, that kind of stuff. But it's the same thing with books. Like, and so a lot of the books, like Richard Wright and others, they were all banned in the 1950s and after that. But the Cold War was a really intense period. Now, having said that, one of the most important libraries in Southern California, which still exists, is the Southern California Library for Social Studies and Research. It is at 6120 South Vermont, which is in the community, South LA. It has been there since the 1950s. It was established by communists who were involved with the Civil Rights Congress. And basically, it's like people's personal collections of books and other things, and became personal collections of papers. And it's still there, struggling, you know, because it's not a public library and it's not a private library. It's a public space supported by private funds or whoever's willing to support it. And what's amazing about that space is that it's always been in a Black community. And whenever, whether we're talking about the Watts Rebellion or 1992, no one's ever touched it. It's always been protected.
Right.
Always been protected. And it also became a really important after-school space for meetings. And so I think there's a long history certainly of labor libraries, of left spaces where they create both collections of books, but also community spaces for people to come together. And again, this is diametrically opposed to the idea of the conformist anti-communist 1950s, when almost everything was under suspicion, and yet, when you think about today, so much of the attacks on librarians, on libraries, they use the same language of anti-communism, the same language of the Red Scare, more so than they use the language of like Jim Crow, And I think that's significant for lots of different reasons.
Yeah, one of the things, I know you want to answer, but we're having a good time up here, having a conversation. But one of the things that I was struck by in the DeSantis rhetoric was the homophobic,
Yes.
implicitly homophobic rhetoric about indoctrination. That especially folks who are doing, queer theory, queer studies, are indoctrinating young people, which is exactly the language that was used in the McCarthy period, during the Lavender Scare. So you're absolutely right in that, this is a moment that feeds off of other moments,
Yeah, but imagine just how you have to really disrespect someone's intellect to think that you can just give them some information and then you just
Totally right. Yeah.
that's part of the mythology.
Yeah, totally right.
And can I just one last thing? I think the point that you make about the surveillance, right? The surveillance apparatus and how it's operating, right? There's this really interesting educational technology that's called bookmarked, and it's a capital ED at the end of mark. So like bookmark ed. And its goal is to make it easier for librarians to find out, like up to the minute, which books are being challenged and which books are being banned. But there's also this other element to it where it gives parents the ability to stay abreast of what their kids are checking out from the library. So we'll send them an alert, and it's marketed as like it's not marketed as surveillance, but it is marketed as this thing for parents to be involved in their children's library practices, right? And so one of the things that I'm also thinking about is how the surveillance apparatus is now kind of intersecting with these, tech apps and tech ed, in facilitating the way surveillance operates in schools, right?
Yeah.
So how is it working? Is it working as a like a information web to let people know as a warning, or as an information web to let people know we need to fight to defend this book?
It's mostly, so this is something that's being advertised or being sold in Texas schools right now.
Okay, well,
And
we
so
know where
it's-
this was.
Okay, yeah.
Right. And so whatever the new legislation is that
Yeah.
Texas has just passed or is about to pass, they're marketing themselves as being an agent of that legislation.
The reason you just remind me of something. I know we're time short, but let me just say, when you look at the list, I went through and looked at the list of all the books, county by county, banned in Florida. And there's actually a counter-banning movement, because Brevard County is almost all Christian literature in the Bible. So I think it's a really interesting thing that's going on where, so when you look at the numbers are huge, but I think they're also inflated by the fact that there's a counter-movement to basically say we're going to take all the Christian literature and challenge that. Which is, go back and look at the list. I'm not making it up.
And who's doing that, Robin?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Certain counties have like a whole, we're talking about like 40, 50, 60 either Bibles, versions of Bibles, children's books that are Christian books. And clearly it's clearly coming from individuals or constituencies who think, okay, this is going to be a way of challenging the challenge.
Okay. Wow.
So I think that's something to pay attention to. That's why I asked the question about the software, because it's kind of like, the anti-drone software says every time the U.S. dropped it,
Right.
shoots a
Right.
drone off, you know where it is, not because you're supporting it. Sorry.
Well, no sorries. We have a question from Earl Ross. The banning of books is about power, right? How should we think about the intersection between these books and required reading titles assigned to high school students? Is the selection of quote unquote important books in the canon about power too? And,
Yes.
Yes.
I don't know if you want to say more about that. My son decided not to choose a particular college because there's this quote unquote core curriculum that went, and it's like all of that stuff is already in my brain, and I don't want someone telling me what to read. But I think about Texas, what we've mentioned already, but also, is this the same thing that DeSantis is doing?
Do you want to take that?
Yeah, I just have a thought about canons. I don't know how many of you saw Across the Spider-Verse this summer. I saw it like 3 times in theaters, right? And that whole movie is about, sorry to spoil things for you, it's been out for a while, but that whole movie is about disrupting canon, right? And there's this deep critique of like fan bros and like their deep love of like the specific way that Spider-Man or other sort of superhero narratives are supposed to go, how they're supposed to function. And the core of that film is about breaking canon and telling a different story. And so, yes, of course, the required books that you have to read in school are about power. I remember having to read Lonesome Dove when I was in high school for an AP class. It's a Western. It made no sense for me to be reading this like 400-page book that's about people migrating to the West. It was boring and I didn't like it. But the point is, the whole thing that I think that you've already pointed out is that a lot of the books that are being banned are telling different stories. And one of the folks that I think a lot with in my own research is Sylvia Wynter, and I was just rereading some of her work earlier this week. And one of the things that she's adamant about and that keeps coming up in the stuff that she's published in the last decade is how we get people to tell a different story. Not necessarily embrace, a particular narrative of what it means to operate in the world or what it means to be present in the world, but to simply tell a different story about who we are so that we can lead better lives that are less violent to earth, to each other, that are less capitalistically driven, right? And so I think that when we're thinking about canon and we're thinking about power, and we're thinking about these stories and these book bans and so on and so forth, we really have to come back to narrative and storytelling and what it's doing for people. And you can get all of that from Across the Spider-Verse in a theater near you.
Right.
That's your plug.
Right.
Look.
Well, I totally agree with that. And this is a different thing, but I would make the case for the core curriculum. And this is why. It's not about great books. And because when I was at Columbia, we had core curriculum, and so we chose faculty and students together that everyone's going to read Fanon, Frantz Fanon, for those who don't know. And the idea wasn't that there are some books that everyone has to read, but what's great is when everyone reads the same thing, you actually have a different kind of conversation that brings in everything around this one thing that everyone's kind of tied to. So the issue to me is like to destroy the canon and not to create a new canon, but to figure out ways to read together, and that's the beauty of the study group.
Yeah.
And I always thought of if you do the core right, it is simply a mass study group. If you do it wrong, then you end up getting people like Richard Spencer and DeSantis.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that, I've written critiques of the canon, but as mechanisms of exclusion, right? When they exclude other literatures. But I also think you need to know the canon.
Right.
I'll never forget the moment that Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, Whiteness in the Literary Imagination dropped. I was a student at Howard, and I was trying to figure out what to do with my senior thesis. And for those who haven't read that book, she goes through the most canonical text but to find an Africanist presence. So how does this Black presence enable Moby Dick, and enable, Melville? The same thing with Twain, right? And then out of that, she has a completely different orientation and theory of American literature. That it could not be, the most canonical parts of American literature could not exist without this metaphorical presence that, of course, is occasioned by the actual presence of Black people, right? And so I just remember at that moment, oh, right, like part of what she's trying to get us to do is to read the canon differently. And then there's this wonderful interview that I think is still on YouTube, where Stuart Hall, the Black British intellectual, interviews C.L.R. James.
James, right? Yeah.
And C.L.R. James talks about his love for the book Vanity Fair.
Right.
Exactly. I mean, just like a canonical text, but it taught him about class inequalities, and racialized class inequalities, right? And so, I mean, that's one of the things that really excites me about the history of Black people as critical readers, right? The way in which, whether you're talking about the blue-black speller, which is how a lot of enslaved folks learn to read, or if you're talking about this person's reading of Shakespeare or Ralph Ellison's reading of Faulkner, Emerson, the way that Angela Davis used to teach, when she was doing Intro to African American Studies, she began with the Kant's A Critique of Pure Reason, So the way in which, scores of Black intellectuals, Black radicals, figured out how to read against the grain.
Right.
That I think is the adventure when it comes to canonical text.
Oh, yeah. No, that's true. You can't even understand Hegel phenomenology of spirit unless you know that Hegel's reading about the Haitian Revolution.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Every day. That's true.
Thank you. In my mind, I'm making a whole bunch of other connections too. Hopefully, I will write them down before they get too hazy. But I'll just have to listen to this again because this will be on our YouTube channel at some point. So folks who didn't get to see it or hear it, tell your friends you still have a chance. So we have a few more questions. I do want to mention, before I forget, there are copies of the anthology for sale in back. Subtext Books is here. So thank you, our partners at Subtext. So, if you don't have it already, go pick that up. But we do have a few more really good questions. Here is an anonymous question. How have the titles on the banned books list changed in the past 20 years? Can we discern from the list how publishing has changed, how society has changed, how demographics or how we identify ourselves have changed?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm thinking specifically about the publishing element, right? As a struggling creative writer myself, and I don't know that the presence of more books featuring folks of color, Black folks, and queer folks necessarily means that publishing has radically changed. And I say that because there's a couple years ago, probably in 2020, there was a hashtag that was publishing paid me, right? And there were a number of specifically women of color writers who were tweeting into that hashtag and sharing what their advances were and what their book deals were. And they were like $5,000, right? And so their books made it out into the world, but what they were compensated for is relatively small compared to what their white female counterparts were making, some of whom first books out were six-figure book deals, right? And so there's a way that publishing can sort of leverage the language of, like we already know how diversity, equity, and inclusion works and how institutions leverage that language and that framework to say that we're doing something, but then they, on the back end, are not actually, doing equitable work. It just looks like equity because they put a Black person in front of somebody. And so I can't speak to how the titles have changed over the last 20 years. I don't have that information in my head, but I do know that The Bluest Eye was the #1 challenged book in Texas still, and that came out in the 70s, the early 80s?
69, wasn't it?
Oh, 69, okay, well, late 60s, right? There are a number of books, I think even in between, actually here in Minnesota, California, a large portion of New England, there's Genderqueer, a memoir, was the #1 challenged book, right? So we can see, I think, a transformation in the kind of content that's being banned. But a lot of those books that have consistently been on the list, like The Diary of a Part-Time Indian or Speak, a lot of those books are still on there.
To Kill a Mockingbird.
Right.
Still on the list, Yeah, I don't know. I haven't looked. I didn't do my homework to look the last 20 years. I had enough trouble looking at the 1,600 titles before. But I think you're absolutely right. And there's more than one book about banned books. And it's interesting how consistent, there's a core of about 40 books that are just constantly banned from the 1950s. And then I think you're right that in terms of gender and sexuality, it seems like there's an uptick. Although I don't know if there's an uptick in terms of, there may be an uptick just in terms of numbers, but certainly not in terms of focus. Because, I mean, in the 1950s, so many of the books, even books that are not, even Simone de Beauvoir, banned book,
Yeah.
So.
Well, this is the thing that's so insidious about the right-wing attack. You don't really have to have a glaring title, in order for the book to be targeted or charged. Right. So, for instance, one of my cousins teaches elementary school in Cobb County, Georgia, outside of Atlanta. And there was a teacher who was fired because she taught a book called My Shadow is Purple.
Oh, right.
Where purple could have been a metaphor for queerness, but it also could have been a metaphor for disability. It could have been a metaphor for a lot of things, right? And I point that out to say that it doesn't have to be, the sort of obviously queer title, the obviously raced title, or obviously feminist title. I mean, this is the point of fascism, right? That anything could be the reason for the crackdown, even the thing that you think is the most innocuous.
Right. Exactly. There's only one exception: mediocrity.
Yeah. Right.
That's the only exception.
Exactly, right.
But
That's
you're
to
right.
protect the category.
Because if mediocrity is a measure, I got a long list.
I'm going to combine a couple of questions here so that we can fit more in. Can you talk about how we work against book banning and where it's been successful, and maybe what we can do as individuals to help work against this?
Maybe, Robin, you want to talk about the anthology and,
Oh, right.
Yeah,
because I don't feel like I have a real radical answer. But we put out this book, Our History Has Always Been Contraband, and we did it very quickly in response to what happened in Florida. Although in some ways it's a response to what happened basically in 44 states passing laws, some kind of legislation banning some kind of knowledge or calling out anything having to do with race, gender, sexuality. So in many ways, what we were able to do was Colin Kaepernick's publishing company and Haymarket Books combined to get this book out and to give them away. They went to Florida and gave away thousands to high school students and junior high school students, and gave them away digitally as well. Because there's no one's trying to make money. It was about basically trying to get it out there. And the anthology itself has really excerpts from what we think of as important texts in Black studies. They're excerpts of just a tiny kind of, segment of a huge body of literature to really whet appetites. So there's that. But in terms of other kinds of strategies, East Side Freedom Library is a strategy. That is, create libraries, create community libraries, find ways to, on the one hand, take back the public space, but on the other hand, not give up the fact that public funds should be supporting. Because one thing I'm always worried about is that, once we shouldn't have to relinquish access to public funds to do things for public. And when the right is taking over these legislative assemblies and running things, and give you a really good example, the state of Florida, if you read the Stop Woke Act, there's a clause in there about money that was appropriated from the state legislature to form in 2020 the Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom. That's under the Stop Woke Act. And that's to advance free trade agreements at the expense of public education. And Florida International University got all this money, public money. They got public money. We're not even talking about right-wing think tank money. They got that too. So part of taking back the public is to be able to transform the spaces that are funded by the public to be safe, free spaces so that there's no banning. Number three, what's wrong with the judiciary? Why do we even have this conversation? Like, why can't it just be like, this is illegal, it's unconstitutional, and that's it? But that's another story. And then finally, when you think about why we have book bans, that's the bigger question, and Rod began with this. It's a political struggle. So we can fight to try to save books, or we could try to fight for power, And I think that you have to do the latter especially, because there's no reason why state legislatures all over the country should be these right-wing fascist machines, and we have to fight to take that back.
Yeah, I would just add to that, it reminds me of, okay, so when I was in high school, and after our elders had said to us, you will form a county junior NAACP. And so one of the things that we did was to argue for a Black Studies course in Manchester, Georgia. At the same time, which had never seen it. They used to give us that reading list of like, okay, here are some of the canonical authors that you could read, as a freshman, junior, sophomore. And I remember there was only Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings on that. And this was the 80s, mid-80s, okay? So right at the moment that Black women writers are coming to their own, there was just one Black author and one Black woman on there. Anyway, so we argue for that as a junior NAACP. But we also, and this goes to Robin's point, we also knew that we could not simply leave it to, the formal channels of the school. So we had our own reading groups. There was, my Black bookstore was the Shrine of the Black Madonna in Atlanta. in the West End.
That's a classic book.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so this is before, of course, the internet. And so there was a blue catalog with a little binder, black binder on it. And there were no pictures, there were no descriptions. And I remember getting it in the mail and thinking, oh, in the Encyclopedia of Famous Black Americans that Mama got us, I see this woman, Toni Morrison, on there, and her book, Tar Baby. Let me get that book. You know, or I was studying French at the time, the Negritude poets. So I got that book. So we all circulated those books, Joseph Harris's text about African history. You know, and again, this is rural Georgia, but we were very literate. So we were like, you know, reciting Bernard Dadier, you know, and Aimé Césaire. You know, so we were having the classroom outside of the classroom, you know? And that's part of an answer to the question, right? There has to be the literal classroom, but there's also got to be the classroom outside of the classroom.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly.
Yeah, I agree with on the topic of having your own sort of book clubs. I have a friend named Steve who's just adamant that like whenever we drop. So I don't know if you know what Discord is. Let me start there. Okay, so Discord's this kind of like, think of it like Twitter, but a gated community. You get to decide who's in your little space. And we have a books channel in there. We're always dropping new books that come out. And Steve is always like, let's read it together, which we don't necessarily have time for, but we have made the effort to make time for you know, even just once every few months to read one of those popular titles that keep coming back up. And so like I've got to read Parable of the Sower with some of my friends who had never read Octavia Butler's work. And I love Octavia Butler. I've always read her stuff. And so but part of that is because he keeps pushing us to not just read the books, but to have conversations about them, and to just not do the reading in isolation. So I think that that's one individual way that you can sort of combat some of the issues that we're experiencing. And I think that also goes toward the sort of getting at the underlying foundation of what's producing the book bans, right? Because you're not just reading the book, you're having a conversation about it. You're beginning to develop the language to tell a different story. I think the other thing is, Minneapolis has got to have more little free libraries outside of their homes than I've seen in any city. I see them everywhere. But when I go past them, it's a lot of books that folks discarded.
Right.
So populate those things with good literature. And not good literature in like in terms of a canon or anything like that, but populate those things with books that are going to inspire somebody. That's going to help them tell a different story. Don't just put the books that the library wouldn't take in the free library. And I think one other thing that I always come back to, Mariam Kaba, noted prison abolitionist, right? Every time there was some instance of Black death in the media, folks would say, what can we do? That's always the question, what can we do? And so she finally got tired of tweeting the same tweet and she just pinned it to her page. And one of the things that she tells people to do is find the people who are already organizing. They've done the work. Figure out what your gift is. That might be organizing people. That might be, you know, cold calling people. It might be delivering food to people, right? Like your gift is your gift. Figure out what that is and reach out to those folks who are already organizing and offer that to them.
That's right.
And the other thing, money never hurts. If you got it, give it.
Great. Thank you. We don't have a lot of time left. I think we'll probably go a little bit longer than like the time when we thought we were going to end this party, but we're not going to stay here all night. And I want people to have time to talk with each other, not just with the folks here. But there are a couple of questions that are getting more popular. And I wanted to get to one. Zhu asks, how do we get teachers to bring more banned books into the classroom, especially when thinking about the limited funds that districts teachers have? Teachers are buying their own stuff when we should be buying that for them. So they end up continuing to teach the classics, AKA mainly white books. I don't know if I should read that again because I sort of broke up the sentence. But,
The question is basically, how do we get more banned books in the classrooms without it having to come at the expense of teachers' pockets?
Or just how do we get more banned books into the classroom, rather
Right.
than
So there's sort of two
maybe
things.
the dominant culture
Right, because
or
the
supremacist.
unspoken thing is also, going back to the story that Rod told, that sometimes there are consequences for people to do. I mean, first of all, the fact that we even say that is ridiculous. But the fact that that people could lose their jobs, the fact that public education across the country has changed so dramatically under every administration. I talked about Arnie Duncan and Obama gearing towards not just STEM but testing, and so even the idea of getting certain books in that are not banned is hard enough, you know. So it's a hard question, but you know, I'm sure other people have better answers. But I know one thing: teachers who operate in total isolation always are left vulnerable. Unions that don't protect teachers' sort of free speech rights and their ability to do what they need to do for the students, that's a hindrance. There are organizations like Rethinking Schools and the Zen Education Project that are communities that do just this. They provide, you know, not just banned books, but books that would be banned if they were not banned, you know, and alternative curricula. And that's a community, you know, project. It's a project that can't be done by simply, you know, giving a list to teachers and say, well, why don't you adopt this? I don't know, I'm sure there's more to it, but.
Yeah, you know, there's a wonderful, I saw a wonderful news segment about these black teens in Florida, in one of the towns, and I'm forgetting the name of it, that has a history of, there was a catastrophic race riot, you know, in the town. The knowledge of it has been suppressed. Okay.
Oh, you're talking about
What is that town? There's a black gentleman who's trying to keep that.
yeah,
Communities.
Rosewood.
It's not Rosewood, is it?
Yeah.
It's not Rosewood. It's another town. That's we don't. You know, there's been no movie made about it.
Okay.
Right? But like the black people know the story. They've told the kids the story. And the kids rightly see the ways in which the anti-woke law and the book bans are about the continued suppression of that story. So one of the things that the kids say in it, which, you know, I mean, it's sort of like out of the mouths of babes, right? Like, we have to do what our teachers can't do. You know? We have to, in a sense, become the teachers who will disseminate this story and keep this history alive. So that's the way I would adjust the question, right? Not how necessarily how to get banned books into classrooms that are already vulnerable, but how do we get more people to activate the teachers within themselves, right? You know, so that you're not, it's not the burden of one person, there's an entire community and collective, you know, that is engaged in critical pedagogy at that point.
I think part of that conversation too is also kind of instilling in people the very thing that I think public education systems kind of condition students against, right? Like the idea is that you fall in line, you follow the rules, you do what we tell you to do. And in terms of like book bans and like what we're asking people to do is break the rules essentially. And that comes with very serious consequences. And so part of mobilizing young people to do the things that teachers can't do is to tell them it's okay to break the rules righteously, right? And so this also again comes back to the question of where are young people in this conversation and how are we bringing them up in the world for like, you know, righteous resistance.
Yeah, where's the good trouble?
Right, exactly.
You know?
Right.
We have several more amazing questions, seriously, and I don't think we can get to them all. It's about time. I'd like to get to at least a couple of them. I don't know if you can be brief, but I'm having a hard time, and we're all having a hard time because there are several really smart questions here.
Okay.
But I want to ask real quick, maybe, Kristen, you sort of talked about this in a way. Sarah asks, in St. Paul Public Schools, parents are emailed weekly by Securely, an app that provides surveillance on child's internet searches on the school-issued iPad. How do we collectively advocate for our children's right to privacy and curiosity?
That's not a brief question. I don't know who asked that, but like, find me after. I have so many thoughts on this. I think, again, I don't think that it's not an individual response, one, and I think this is part of the difficulty of like the digital world that we navigate right now, right? We exchange so many rights and privileges in exchange for free products and services, right? Mm-hmm. That's how all of this stuff works. And so presumably, I'm assuming the iPads are given to the students for free in the school system, right? And so that comes with all of this preloaded software on it that's going to surveil them. Now, one of the things that you could do is ask if you can opt out. That's not always possible, but that's one of the things that you can ask. And in fact, a lot of this stuff should come where you're already opted out, but it doesn't work that way. So one of the immediate ways that I can think about it is ask to be opted out of that. The other thing, I know like iPads are sexy, but don't use the iPad if you can. I don't know how much of the like school like curriculum and stuff is built around the iPad, but any way that you can get access to your own personal technology where you are not subjecting yourselves or your students, your young people to surveillance, that's the only other way that I can think of quickly off the top of my head.
Mm-hmm. Well, also just to add, like, it would be great if those parents would form an organization, right? One that rebuts the right wing who want to get us to think that the only way to be a parent is for you to be a police officer or a CIA agent. Mm-hmm. What would it mean if there was an organization of parents that decided we will reclaim the kind of parenting that Kristen got from her dad or that I got from my mama, as a rebuttal to the weaponization of parenting, at this moment. Mm-hmm. That would be great.
Mm-hmm. Sort of a quick follow-up, mostly for Kristen. I'm going to ask, I'm interested in hearing your take on the intersection of tech and attacks on knowledge/learning. How do you see AI affecting banning, censorship? Do you foresee the right weaponizing AI in these knowledge wars?
Oh, yeah.
So we'll talk about this later. And folks living virtually, these conversations can continue. But.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts about generative AI specifically, right? Definitely, of course. I mean, I think they're already mobilizing it. We already had the whole conversation about deepfakes, right? Like we're already seeing how AI technology has been weaponized by right-wing conservatives. And so as we transition into more generative AI with ChatGPT and other things like it, certainly that's going to continue to be leveraged in service to right-wing conservatism. The question that I'm literally right now exploring is how, especially as these technologies become even more sophisticated, and our ability to kind of distinguish between what a computer generated versus what a person wrote becomes more and more difficult over time. And I think honestly, now that I'm kind of just thinking about it right now, I think that that's also one of the ways that it's going to be weaponized is when you can't make a distinction between who did what. It becomes it makes media literacy even more difficult, right? And I think one of you brought that up, the question of media literacy, right? Like a lot of these things that are being banned are also disrupting everyone's ability, not just young people, but everyone's ability to engage with the material that they're encountering in digital spaces. And so when we're using ChatGPT, for example, it's not the only one, but as an example to produce essays and things like that that are heavily cited, right? when you're so short on time, everybody's overworked, right? Everybody's underpaid. You want something very quick that's just going to give you information so that you can get it and move on. Everyone doesn't necessarily have the time to sit down and be like, is this citation being, like, they don't do necessarily what I have to do in my classes and things like that. And so I think that, it's a problem, in short. But I can't give a short answer to that question. I'm sorry.
Good answer.
Yeah, just that AI perpetuates what's always most dominant. I have an example just with internet searches that I use with my students. It's like, you can't just get this off of Google.
Right.
There are these things in the back of the book that will tell you, and you can interrogate. We're going to do one more question. I hate to do this because there are a dozen great questions here, but we're running out of time, and there's one that has gotten a lot of attention. I put it out because this person already asked a question, but it is very good, as their previous one was. We are talking about banned books in the American context. What is the international discourse surrounding banned books? Should we see the idea of banned books as a sort of American exceptionalism? How should we define danger?
And that last sentence, I'm trying to figure out how it relates to everything. It's definitely not American exceptionalism. I mean, I just read an article about each major country, including the BRICS, and how they're also moves toward banned books. There's a kind of romance about Europe, like Europeans are so more advanced, but there's banned books in European nations. Certainly banned books in South Africa. I mean,
Israel.
Well, yeah. In fact, it's not exactly the same thing, but the model, DeSantis's model for anti-woke, part of it, it comes from the anti-Nakba laws. That you can't teach the Nakba in Palestinian schools or in Israel. So I don't think it's an exception at all. But I don't know enough about what's happening where and how and what the basis of it might be.
Yeah. And, part of the reason that it's not exceptional is because what the Republicans are doing is part of a transnational movement. Right? In terms of the emergence and quest for dominance of authoritarian, political regimes, So there's nothing exceptional about what's happening now. I mean, which is also why we need to think transnationally, in terms of our responses to it.
Right.
Snaps. I don't have anything to add.
Well, thank you. I am just tempted to keep going with the questions, but I know we don't have the space for it. But we do have the space for continuing this conversation here and outside. Remember, there are some books, we were able to get some books that are for sale with subtext. Thank you, everyone who's here, especially our esteemed panel. This is a great conversation. Thank you for Peter for connecting all of this and all of the work of all of the staff here. Folks have done a great job. We've had a lot going on this week. We have a lot more going on in the next week, which you're welcome to join us for. There are flyers there talking about our banned book series, so there are some more events with this. They're on the counter there. Sign up for our newsletter, folks who are watching virtually. If you are not getting our newsletter, you can go to our website and sign up. More conversations like this are happening all the time. And I know there's something else I want to say, but I want
the Institute for Advanced Studies. Thank you.
Oh, yes.
Right.
Yes. And thank you for that partnership. We are fortunate to have so many partners, so many connections that raise the profile of important conversations in ways that we couldn't do ourselves. So, yes, thank you. I'm so happy to be at least tangentially connected to so many great scholars and artists and culture makers and thinkers. And that's why I work here. So enjoy the rest of this week and the rest of this month. I think it's going to be fall here in Minnesota tomorrow. So finally, so enjoy that as well. And have a good night.